Imagine an emperor so warped by his own obsessions that he took a teenage boy, castrated him, dressed him in the robes of a murdered empress, and forced him into a public wedding, while an entire empire watched in horror. Picture Rome, master of the known world, bowing its head as its supreme ruler paraded through marble palaces with a child turned into the ghost of his own dead wife. That bride was Sporus, a boy mutilated, costumed, and crowned to replace the woman Nero himself had beaten to death. This is no myth. This is no rumor. This is the monstrous reality of Nero Caesar, a ruler whose cruelty and theatricality shattered every boundary. Let us step back to Rome in the 1st century AD, a city of dazzling marble forums, of chariot wheels rattling down stone-paved roads, of senators cloaked in purple, debating the fate of a world they believed they had conquered. Rome was at its height, its empire stretching from sun-scorched Egypt to the wild, misty isles of Britain. It was a civilization that believed in order, in hierarchy, in law, all held together by the will of a single ruler, the emperor. Into this world was born Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, a child who would one day stand atop this empire like a living god. He was the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, that twisted family line that had brought Rome both Augustus's brilliance and Caligula's horrors. Nero was raised in a household that worshipped power but understood nothing of love. His mother Agrippina had clawed her way to the top through marriages, poisonings, and blackmail. His stepfather Claudius, the emperor before him, was a man whom Agrippina had married only to get Nero onto the throne. This was no fairy tale childhood. It was a breeding ground for terror. Nero came to power at 17, his mother standing behind him like a spider pulling the threads. At first, he tried to rule well, guided by wise counselors like Seneca the philosopher and Varus the Praetorian prefect. But the taste of absolute power soon turned to poison in his mouth. Rome was a stage, and Nero believed he was the greatest actor the world had ever seen. He dreamed of being adored, worshipped, cheered on as both emperor and performer. Yet behind the stage mask, there lurked a darkness so profound that it would devour everyone close to him, even eventually a child named Sporus. Here is where the horror takes a savage and deeply unsettling turn. In the year 65 AD, Nero, the young emperor who once promised Rome a golden age, lost control in a flash of rage against his wife Poppaea Sabina. She was a woman of remarkable beauty, clever and ambitious, who had once schemed at Nero's side to eliminate his own mother. Yet for all her charms and her hold over Nero, she was never truly safe. According to the historians, one day during an argument, Poppaea spoke out of turn. Nero, prone to violent tempers, struck her, a single blow so vicious that it crushed her belly. She died shortly after, some said carrying his unborn child. One careless moment of fury, one slip of a man's hand, and the woman who had helped Nero secure his throne lay lifeless at his feet. But here's the truly chilling part. What should have been a moment of grief or guilt instead became the seed of a monstrous obsession. Nero refused to accept Poppaea's death. He could not bear the emptiness left behind, and so he chose to replace her, not with another woman, but with a living replica. A perfect, breathing doll to stand in for his murdered wife. He found Sporus, a boy of barely 15, whose delicate features and gentle manner reminded the emperor of Poppaea. It was not enough for Nero to simply mourn. He had to resurrect her in the flesh, or at least a twisted parody of her. Sporus was castrated to preserve his childlike beauty, stripped of any chance to grow into manhood, and then costumed in imperial silks fit for an empress. He was forced to mimic Poppaea's voice, to copy her gestures, to step into her gilded slippers and become her in every way Nero desired. In a macabre ceremony, Nero married Sporus in full view of the imperial court, complete with wedding veil, nuptial feast, and all the honors of a Roman bride. Every nobleman, every senator, every trembling courtier was compelled to watch this hideous theater. They saw the emperor place a ring on a boy's finger, heard him vow to love and cherish the living puppet, and knew that refusal to applaud might mean their own death. It was a spectacle Rome had never seen before, a horrifying, blasphemous joke on marriage, power, and grief. And behind it all, a single truth. Sporus had been forced to fill the bed and the heart of a man who had murdered the woman he was replacing. If you think this is impossible to believe, remember that Roman chroniclers confirmed every step of this grotesque tale. Suetonius, Tacitus, Cassius Dio, they wrote it down with disgust and horror, and their words still chill the blood today. As news of Nero's wedding spread, Rome's uneasy calm began to crack. How could a ruler so powerful, so divine, behave in a way that mocked every principle of Roman manhood and family? Here was an emperor not only killing his pregnant wife, but then performing a monstrous parody of marriage with a child in women's robes. Every few weeks, fresh rumors rippled through the city. Some said Sporus had no choice but to smile at Nero's side for fear of torture or death. Others whispered that Nero made Sporus call him husband and address the boy as Poppaea, as though Poppaea had returned from the grave. Imagine the moment, a royal procession through the Forum with Sporus lifted on a litter, hailed by soldiers as Augusta, the traditional title of an empress. The boy would have been no older than 15, skin smooth and unshaven, eyes hollow with shock. And Rome, the mightiest city on earth, stood watching, afraid to laugh, afraid to cry, afraid to say a single word. Opposition festered. Senators feared they would be next, forced into some fresh humiliation. Generals plotted in whispers, convinced that Nero was destroying the dignity of the empire. Even the common people, who once adored Nero for his games, his chariot races, his music, now found the spectacle beyond the pale. Meanwhile, Nero doubled down, putting on ever more extravagant shows. He competed in poetry contests, sang on stage, even forced senators to sit in the theater for hours to applaud his every note. But none of these performances was as disturbing as his living puppet, Sporus, whose very body was a monument to Nero's crimes. Now picture, if you can bear it, the palace at night. The corridors lit by guttering lamps, their shadows dancing grotesquely across marble statues of long-dead emperors. There, in the echoing halls, Nero waits. Wrapped in a silken robe embroidered with golden flowers, he calls for Sporus, his bride, his puppet, his tragic mirror. The boy comes, eyes downcast, his steps muffled on polished floors. Silk rustles around his thin shoulders. Servants stand silent along the walls, each one holding back their revulsion behind carefully neutral faces. They have drawn lots among themselves to decide who must help dress Sporus tonight, who must powder his face, who must comb the fine dark hair into the likeness of Poppaea's style. And when Sporus approaches, Nero takes his hand gently, as though this were a true romance. A lover's smile, a soft word, then the command, "Come to my bed." The boy cannot refuse. He is the emperor's creation after all, a living monument to a dead woman, molded by the tyrant's whims. This was the price of absolute power in Rome, a world where a man could kill his wife, then force a child to become her shade. Where the emperor's lust and grief mingled into something so poisonous that no one dared even name it aloud. And yet there they were, torchlight glimmering off polished tiles, the scent of roses thick in the hot air, as a boy in a bridal gown stepped across a threshold into a nightmare he could never escape. Rome was not built on softness. Its gods rewarded conquest, valor, and masculine virtue. So when the most powerful man in the world publicly took a child bride, castrated to mimic a murdered wife, the insult to Roman identity cut deep. Opposition hardened. The Senate began to scheme. Governors in the distant provinces, men who had once fought at Nero's side, quietly built alliances against him. They saw a man who was no longer emperor, but a deranged actor, who turned Rome into a private theater of blood and humiliation. Every new banquet became an exercise in terror. Nero might laugh one moment, then have a senator executed the next. Sporus sat at his side, silent, forced to play the loving wife while heads rolled around them. In one particularly sickening banquet, Nero supposedly made Sporus recite Poppaea's favorite lines of poetry, word for word in a child's voice, while the courtiers pretended to enjoy it. Imagine the taste of honeyed wine on your tongue, trying to swallow it while a teenage boy reenacts the lines of a woman his husband had murdered. The empire was reaching a breaking point, and Nero seemed to sense it. In his paranoia, he killed trusted allies, stripped the treasury bare to fund his games, and demanded more honors from the Senate. Rome was a powder keg, and every insane spectacle poured more oil on the flames. By the year 68 AD, the empire was splintering. Nero's unhinged excesses, his songs, his races, his murderous whims, and above all the ghastly spectacle of Sporus had driven Rome to the breaking point. Rebellions sparked like brush fires across the provinces. In Hispania, the seasoned governor Galba declared himself emperor. Vitellius in the north raised his legions. Otho, once Nero's trusted ally, positioned himself to seize power. Rome, exhausted and humiliated, was ready for anyone who might end the reign of the artist tyrant who had forgotten how to rule. As his enemies advanced, Nero clung ever tighter to the only illusion he had left: Sporus. Like a broken man clutching a childhood doll, he refused to let go of the boy who had come to stand for everything he had lost. Nero packed Sporus along with him as he prepared to flee the city, refusing to leave behind the living monument to Poppaea. Some sources say he whispered to Sporus that they could start anew somewhere far away, as husband and wife, as if the rest of the world could be made to forget. But there would be no new beginning. The Praetorian Guard, those soldiers who had once sworn to protect him, abandoned him for Galba. Even Rome's slaves mocked him as he tried to slip away in disguise, covering his imperial robes with a ragged cloak. The emperor of all the world was now a fugitive, creeping through the night toward a friend's villa on the outskirts of the city, with Sporus, dressed as an empress, clinging to him like a final tragic echo of his madness. Try to imagine that sight. The most powerful man on earth, his hair tangled with sweat, hiding in the shadows, clutching the hand of a boy in women's silks, running from an empire that had finally rejected him. The city that once hailed him as a god now thirsted for his blood. At the villa, news arrived that the Senate had officially declared him a public enemy. Soldiers were coming to arrest him. Cornered, frantic, and unwilling to face the humiliation of capture, Nero turned to his boy bride one last time, tears streaking his face. Ancient sources claim he told Sporus that no one would ever love him as Nero had, that he should remember their time together. Then, trembling, Nero pressed a dagger to his own throat, unable to drive it home until a freedman helped finish the act. With that, the final curtain fell on the most grotesque theater Rome had ever seen. What happened to Sporus after Nero's final act of self-destruction was a tragedy so layered that it almost defies belief. When Nero took his own life in 68 AD, Sporus was left behind, still dressed in the silks of a dead empress, still bearing the name Poppaea, still the unwilling star of the macabre play Nero had written for him. Galba, the new emperor, swept into Rome determined to show he had crushed Nero's legacy. And what better proof than to seize the living puppet of that twisted marriage? Galba took Sporus as a kind of trophy, parading him through Rome as living evidence that Nero's foul theater had come to an end. A boy who had been made an empress now forced to stand at the side of the man who replaced Nero. A symbol, more than a human being. But fate was not finished with Sporus. Soon after, another claimant to the throne, Otho, took power. Otho had once been married to Poppaea, the very woman whom Nero had murdered and then forced Sporus to impersonate. In a move that bordered on the grotesque, Otho claimed Sporus for himself, perhaps as a way of reclaiming the lost Poppaea, or perhaps simply to humiliate the boy further. Imagine that. The teenager, once made into Poppaea for Nero's pleasure, was now paraded by Poppaea's real former husband. A cosmic cruelty so savage it feels almost like a sick joke. Sporus was dragged from one powerful man to the next, like a cursed relic, unable to shed the ghost of Poppaea that Nero had stitched onto his very identity. He had no name anymore, no self. He was Poppaea, forever. A symbol of Nero's downfall, a toy for new emperors, a walking memory of Rome's shame. Try to picture it. Sporus, no more than 16 now, dressed still in the robes of a dead woman, eyes empty, forced to bow before senators who mocked him, to stand beside generals who had once served Nero. He was a living ruin, a child with no escape, performing the same hateful role again and again because no one would let him be anything else. In one final indignity, Some accounts say Sporus was scheduled to play Andromeda, the princess in mythology who is chained to a rock and devoured by a sea monster, in a public spectacle under yet another emperor. Sporus, once made to act the wife of a madman, was now being cast as a helpless girl about to be sacrificed for entertainment. In that moment, staring at the arena where he was to be displayed, Sporus chose his own exit. According to the sources, he took his own life rather than suffer one more public violation. That was his tragic finale. A child forced to mimic a dead woman, humiliated by emperors, transformed into a puppet for Rome's nightmares until he could endure no more. Sporus died as he had lived, trapped in a role he had never chosen, the last echo of an emperor's twisted love. So what can we learn from a story this grotesque? Why even remember it? Nero's tale and Sporus's agony shows us what happens when absolute power is held by a man who mistakes cruelty for theater and violence for love. In Rome's greatest days, its laws and legions were meant to protect its people, but under Nero, they became the stage props of a personal nightmare. It reminds us that tyranny is not always about armies or assassinations. Sometimes tyranny wears a costume, sometimes it smiles, sometimes it calls itself love. The Romans who watched Sporus carried through the streets saw more than a humiliated child. They saw the empire's soul, stripped bare and paraded as a puppet. They saw what happened when one man's madness drowned out every voice of reason. And they feared it might happen again, that another emperor might arise who would use absolute power to remake reality itself. Think of Sporus, the teenager in silk, forced to play dead Poppaea in Rome's greatest palaces. That image has haunted historians for 2,000 years. It still asks a terrible question. If absolute power can do that to one boy, what might it do to all of us? Long after Nero's suicide, Roman poets and historians wrote about Sporus in hushed tones. They could barely believe their own empire had allowed such horror to unfold. Yet the lesson stuck. After Nero, emperors had to watch their every move. They had to placate both Senate and soldiers because no one would tolerate another reign of insane theatrical cruelty. Nero had pushed Rome past its breaking point, and Sporus, the child who became a bride, was the living evidence of that collapse. Rome survived Nero, but it never quite healed from him. The memory of Sporus, paraded as a mock empress, showed how fragile Rome's ideals truly were. And so, centuries later, we are still telling this story, not from morbid curiosity, but because it reminds us of a truth both simple and terrifying, that no civilization, however mighty, is safe when it places absolute power in the hands of a single man. Look at Nero. Look at Sporus. Look at the empire that let it happen, and ask yourself, how many empires, how many nations might fall into the same trap again?